in these 2 short minutes of silence, the peoples of the empire remember. We pray that our statesmen may continue their work of ensuring that the terrible mistake of the years 1914 to 1918 may never be repeated.
1 year later, when this man, Neville Chamberlain, became Prime Minister, the peace seemed already to be slipping away. His chief task would be to try and avert war. His policy was summed up in one word: appeasement. Chamberlain had already seen one great war tear Europe apart. He believed another would destroy civilization. But Mussolini, dictator of Italy, was looking for military glory for himself and his country. The Russian dictator Stalin, mysterious and powerful, brooded over Eastern Europe. And Hitler, Führer of Germany, was planning to dominate Europe. Already in March 1936, Hitler, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, had reoccupied the Rhineland. The British and French did nothing to stop him. Hitler hammered his triumph home to the Germans. His message was heard in Britain, especially by Chamberlain. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chamberlain did not object to rearming Britain, but he disliked having to do it by raising taxes and borrowing money.
In an arming world, we couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defense forces again, and we had to pay for it.
By defense forces, Chamberlain was talking principally about the RAF and the Royal Navy. The Navy's great task was to protect the British Empire, strewn around the globe from India and Africa and Canada through New Zealand and Australia to the East Indies. To protect the empire in the Far East, work had begun in 1921 on a great naval base at Singapore. On the surface, Britain looked confident and secure, in control of her empire. But the defense of that empire would pose insoluble problems. For one thing, we could not afford a war here in the East and at the same time fight the dictators in Europe. Many people believed the best way to avoid war was to support the League of Nations. It was a fine thing to believe.
There is, in our judgment, no disputes between nations that cannot be settled by peaceful means.
But the people of Abyssinia had found such talk empty and misleading when their land was invaded by Italian troops in 1935. Mussolini was doing his own empire building in East Africa, and the League did little to prevent him.
It was the most unbearable scene when the fallen emperor confronted the League of Nations. Italian journalists whistled their derision. Haile Selassie faced them with heartbreaking dignity.
Are the states present here today, asked Haile Selassie, going to set up a terrible precedent by bowing before force? What reply shall I take back to my people? The League made no reply. But in Britain, the desire for peace was so strong that many people continued to support the League, particularly the young. They sincerely believed that no one could really want war. A few Britons, like these ex-servicemen, went to Germany and were filmed chatting to Hitler about the 1914 war. They found him reasonable. Wasn't it reasonable to put German troops back into the Rhineland, which was, after all, German soil?
We British never felt anything but great respect for
German enemies in the war years across the other side of the trenches.
Whether Hitler was reasonable or not, back at home, the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, could think of many other reasons against rearming.
The government can find plenty of money for warships and airplanes. Why could they not find money to secure to everyone homes fit to live in, clothing, food, and the means of a happy life?
Still, even the poorest people went to the cinema. Here, the newsreels were showing shots of air bombardment in the Spanish Civil War.
4,000 bombs were dropped out of a blue sky into a hell that raged unchecked for 5 murderous hours. This was a city, and these were homes like yours.
The lesson was clear. No longer was Britain an island fortress. Her cities and her people were wide open to attack from the air. And the planes that had bombed Guernica were German. As Germany flaunted her military strength, the British people and their leaders could well imagine, could almost see the Luftwaffe over undefended British cities. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in May 1937. From the start, he took a strong personal interest in foreign affairs. In November, he sent Lord Halifax, soon to be his Foreign Secretary, to Berlin to find out what Hitler's claims in Europe really were. Hitler told Halifax nothing. Instead, the visit turned into a polite social occasion. But 4 months later, on the 12th of March 1938, Hitler's troops marched unopposed into Austria. Any protests were drowned in a tide of wild enthusiasm. In open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler declared the Anschluss, or union, of Austria with Germany. He'd returned to the land of his birth as Führer of the Greater German Reich. But now Western Czechoslovakia was surrounded by the new Greater Germany. Here were the industrial powerhouses of the Czech state, the factories and the mines. Here, too, were fortifications vital for Czech defense. The Czechs had an efficient, well-equipped army, but against the enemy within, they had few defenses. 3 million Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, mostly in the frontier area called the Sudetenland. Propaganda from the new German Reich across the border was increasing the dislike and contempt they felt for their Czech rulers. In April 1938, Konrad Henlein, leader of the Nazi-backed German Sudeten Party, demanded self-government for the Sudetenland. It was a cruel demand. The Czechs stood to lose not just the Germans, but their industrial strength and their defenses as well. The Czech president, Beneš, seemed to have the choice of hanging on to the Sudetenland at the risk of war with Germany, or giving it up to live in peace. If he decided not to give it up, Beneš could count on the support of a Czech people angered by the Germans' demands. He could send out mobilization papers to his army and hope to call Henlein's and Hitler's bluff. Beneš could also appeal for help to France, Czechoslovakia's ally since 1924. But that was a prospect which alarmed the French government, led by Edward Daladier. In April, Daladier flew to London to sound out the British reaction. But he was to be told by Chamberlain to expect no help from Britain in a war over the Sudetenland. The Maginot Line was in fact where France's policies stopped. An immensely strong system of fortifications the French had built along the German border. This was France's answer to any future threats from Germany in the West. But from the concrete turrets of this expensive hidey-hole, the Sudetenland looked a very long way away. Hitler pressed harder. On Sunday, the 12th of September at Nuremberg, he demanded self-determination for the Sudeten Germans and threatened to send them military assistance. Taking encouragement from Hitler, the Sudeten Germans began to arm themselves. The situation threatened to embroil Europe in war, and Britain with it. The British Prime Minister, entirely on his own initiative, decided to intervene. He flew to meet Hitler, the German Führer, face to face in an attempt to save the peace. At Berchtesgaden, Chamberlain, without consulting his cabinet, the French or the Czechs, gave in to Hitler. He conceded self-determination for the Sudeten Germans. This was appeasement in action. Now his peace plan had to be put to the French and the Czechs. On the 18th of September, Daladier came to Downing Street to discuss the terms. Eventually, he too accepted Hitler's demands. Now everything depended on the response of the Czechs. If they decided to resist, they would have to stand alone. While enemy forces took up positions along their borders, they decided to accept the terms. A triumphant Chamberlain set off to tell Hitler the good news.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
Chamberlain's second journey to see Hitler at Bad Godesberg was humiliating. There were new demands. The Sudetenland must be surrendered at once. Polish and Hungarian claims on Czech lands must be met. Chamberlain refused to accept. Suddenly, war seemed very close. Flying back to London, Chamberlain looked down at the flimsy housing estates and pictured them laid waste by bombs. The Prime Minister expressed the anxiety and the puzzlement of his people.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. War is a fearful thing. We must be very clear before we embark on it that it is really the great issues that are at stake.
The Home Secretary made his appeal to the nation.
I appeal for 1 million men and women to help us with our work. I've had a splendid response. We are going to get our 1 million, but I want all you to come in and give in your names to help us in this great job.
Plans were made to move children out of the threatened capital. Hurriedly, more aircraft were being turned out. Britain's air defenses were still weak and thinly spread. There had to be a way out. At the very least, enough time to get the aircraft program off the ground. When Mussolini suggested a four-power conference, Chamberlain seized the chance. Perhaps it was still not too late to settle the Czech question by international agreement rather than war.
When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this nettled danger, we pluck this flower safety.
In Munich, Italy, Germany, France and Britain came to an agreement to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. The Czechs were not consulted. They were free to resist by themselves if they wanted to. And the peace of Europe was guaranteed by another document signed by Hitler and Chamberlain, the famous piece of paper.
I had
posterity will thank God, as we do now, that in the time of desperate need our safety was guarded by such a man, Neville Chamberlain.
In March 1939, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement and with it the state of Czechoslovakia. It was clear that his next demands would be against Poland. It was time for Britain to rebuild the eastern barrier punctured at Munich. Britain guaranteed to defend Poland and Romania. The question remained, what would the Soviet Union do?
Military weakness in this country encourages potential enemies. Public opinion is growing in favor of compulsory national service in all its forms, and especially in the highest form.
In June 1939, compulsory military service was announced for men between 18 and 20. Recruits were quickly trained in the use of modern weapons. The peace could not be kept much longer. Suddenly, in August 1939, all Europe was shocked by the news of the most astounding agreement of modern times, a pact between communist Russia and Nazi Germany. They'd agreed to bury the hatchets they'd been waving at each other. They would bury them in Poland. Germany would cut her to pieces in the west, while Russia would strike from the east.
Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe versehen.
On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg, lightning war on the Poles. The Poles threw everything into desperate counterattacks, even cavalry against tanks and armored cars. There was no question of who would lose. Now Hitler was where he wanted to be, at war. In the end, appeasement had failed. The only achievement of Chamberlain's policy was that, a year after Munich, Britain was in a better position to fight.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
This series is available in 2 volumes from ABC Marketing. Ring 02 430 3999. Stay with us now as we turn the clock back even further to look at how we used to live in 1876.